Welcome everybody to chesslecture.com. This is your host, International Master John Paul Wallace. Today we're going to have a look at how to crush a variation called the pin variation. I actually had a chance to do damage against it recently myself. It was something I was tempted to play as a junior but never really did, because it's inherently probably just a bit too dodgy, but you'll find people that do attempt to play it. So we're going to have a look at what to do when they spring it on you. But its main advantage is surprise. So e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4. This is the pin variation. Now, people that haven't seen it normally freak out a little bit here and play maybe bishop d3 or even ugly moves like f3, and you can really just get yourself into a bit of a mess. The correct move is e5, knight d5, and now bishop d2. Now, I recently had this and my opponent played bishop takes c3, but after b takes c3, knight c, I think he played, now he played queen c7, and I hadn't seen this position before actually, but I just played queen h5, and in this position I just played queen h5, and actually I just won really easily. It was amazing. He played a6 to stop knight b5, and I just played bishop d3. And of course I don't care, he can take the pawn on c3, but I've just got such a huge lead in development. This is just crushing already. He played d6, I just played e d6, queen d6, castles kingside, and it's all over actually. I mated him pretty quickly. So bishop takes c3 to my mind is pretty weak. Today's game, I'll call him Poco. Played knight takes c3, which is the best move. B takes c3, bishop b7, queen g4, castles again correct, bishop h6, g6, and this is the correct way of playing for black. Unfortunately, Tom Wedberg, who's a Swedish grandmaster, very strong player, doesn't play so much anymore. He was very good at the openings and at attacking. That was his two main fortes, attacking chess and theory. And he played a very good move, which was a novelty in this position. h4. Now, that's a wonderful novelty since this game was played in '84, and since this move was introduced, black's just been under a lot of pressure, and I think it's turned players off trying this opening as black. Now, it's surprising that you don't take on f8, I guess, because it's the exchange, but that's actually what black wants, because after bishop f8, black's king is now quite safe with that dark square bishop, and black's always going to get an extra pawn with queen a5. Is he going to either win the e pawn or maybe the pawn on c3, and the pawn on e5 will always be a long-term weakness anyway. Black actually gets pretty good compensation. After h4, on the other hand, white's idea is really simple. He's just going for mate. He's going to play h5, bishop d3, sack on g6 a few times, and checkmate. Very different way of handling the game, and a better way. Queen a5 was played, queen g3, and now rook d8 was played, but that's probably already an error, and it's not very logical anyway, because the rook moves away from the defense of the king, and it sort of seems like suddenly black's scared of sacrificing the exchange when that was the whole point of the opening. Now let's look at the alternatives. d6, bishop takes f8, bishop takes f8, e takes d6, bishop g7, rook d1, knight c6, and suddenly black has the better game. Not that surprising though, because white's whole idea is not to just go and grab that rook. So after d6, a better move would be e takes d6, bishop f6. Now an exciting move, rook d1 safe, but castle queenside in the position there is now, as you can see, getting mega sharp with a very complicated game. Very difficult really, I think, to assess this. But I think the general theory is that with more pieces out, white's attack is still stronger than black's. Okay. Poco played rook d8, h5. Logical, but maybe even better was knight b3, Wedberg himself considered afterwards. After queen c7 there, you go back to playing h5, and if queen d5, you switch. You got bishop d3, d6, f4, d takes e5, c4, the point of white's play. Queen d7, f takes e5, and black's in a terrible bind. The whole point of that little c4 maneuver was to prevent knight c6 until the queen's back on d7. If the knight was already on c6 and you play c4, then simply queen takes e5 with check. So rook d8, h5, d6, hg6, fg6, bishop f4, d5, bishop e5. Now black would love to play knight d7, but I guess you can spot the win here. It's bishop c7. So you have to play rook d5. There's not really much time to play for slow moves. He really has to eliminate white's most active piece, or pieces, one of them being the rook on d5, the bishop on e5, which is now trying to exchange off. However, if just a cursory glance at the black position, you can see that his king is really nothing protecting it, very weak. The king on e1 might have some weaknesses, but actually there's a lot of white pieces around to sort of keep it safe. So f4, knight d7, bishop c4, good move, just tactically gaining material now. Black has to sacrifice, knight takes e5, bishop d5, queen d5, f takes e5, and now I've reached a more technical phase of the game where this should just be a theoretical win for white. He's up the exchange. More important than that is the black king is still quite weak. Queen e4 check, king d2, bishop d7, rook a1, queen d5. Now Wedberg played queen h3, but he actually criticised that himself because he has a winning move here, if you can spot it. It's rook takes h7, king takes h7, rook h1 check, king g7, queen h2. Nice little move, keeping the pawn on e5 protected. King f7, queen h7 check, king e8, queen takes g6 check, king d8, rook h8 check, and white wins. Picks off the rook on a8, and black's position still remains very dubious. But after queen d5, he played queen h3, which is a little bit too automatic. Now black could have played h5, he didn't. Queen g3, king h7, followed by bishop to e8, which protects the pawn on g6, also prevents infiltration on f7, and this could have been a real game after this. I mean, white does have his own weak king, and he's not on d4. He's sort of tied down to that square because it has to protect his own king. Queen's coming off here in an endgame is far from a win for white. So Wedberg gave his opponent an opportunity with h5 there, but black didn't play it. He played bishop g5 check, king d1 h6. Probably just missed white's next move. Queen d3, bishop to e8, c4. Now the active queen on d5 is being pushed away, and unfortunately for black, if queen takes g2, rook eg1, queen f2, knight takes e6, black's position is just falling apart. If the bishop on g5 moves, you just go rook takes g6 check and sacrifice. It's winning. So after c4, he played queen d7, knight b5, queen takes d3, c takes d3. Knight now coming to d6 provoked a bit of a desperation move for black. Bishop takes b5. Of course, just swapping off in an endgame only makes it worse, but I guess the position was lost anyway. cb5, rook c8, king e2, rook c2 check, king f3, rook a2, and just rook a1, picking up the pawn on a7. Rook d2, rook hd1, and notice that black's, if you don't take on d1, you lose the a7 pawn for free. If you do take on d1, then with the pieces, with the rooks exchange, it just leaves an endgame of rook against a lone bishop. And whenever you've sacrificed the exchange, you're always trying to keep rooks on. Whenever the rook is against your lone piece, it's almost always a loss. So this rook hd1's a good move. Rook b2 was played because he didn't want to go in for that exchange that I just discussed. But then just rook db1, rook d2, rook b3 now covers all white's pawns protected, and there's nothing left for black to do here with the pawn on a7 and pawn on b7 dropping off, so he resigned. Now that was an excellent game by Wedberg, and the key points in summary are, when you're confronted with a variation that you haven't met before, you should not chicken out, because that's actually the quickest way to make that variation sound. You should seriously look at the position and think, what does this move allow that the main line doesn't? And as you can see, after bishop b4, it just allowed white to play e5 and start attacking on as early as move 6. So you should push yourself to go in for the main lines that make this, which is the reason why these lines are dubious. And then it's always good to have a bit of theoretical knowledge, because these lines, normally the only reason they're played is because of surprise value. But now that you're armed with this novelty of Wedberg's h4, instead of grabbing the exchange, you'll have an extra weapon, and anyone that tries to spring this variation on you will probably just be springing something on themselves. So I hope you enjoyed that game, and I look forward to presenting my next lecture for chesslecture.com. Thank you.